our guest this evening is Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin. There's that old cliche about somebody with many hats, but when you describe Tadhg's life to date, it's quite the life. He's been a musician, a writer, a script writer, a TV producer, a teacher, a publisher, and I think he's probably wearing most of those hats still, apart from the teaching.
Correct.
And the TV, I don't do TV anymore.
Anymore. Very, well, not for the moment anyway.
Yeah, no, I've had enough of that.
And you're also a translator, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, which of course,
spare time.
which of course is very relevant tonight. So we're here to talk about Madame Lazare, Tadhg's first novel, which is a novel in the Irish language. It reminds me of almost a 19th century novel. It is epic in its sweep, it's transgenerational, it spans at least 4, 5 countries. It has references to different languages, different religions, different historic moments in time. And I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask Tadhg if he'd give us a quick, insofar as that's possible, plot outline of Madame Lazare.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for the invitation to do this event this evening. It's just lovely to be here. So Madame Lazare is the story of 2 women. A young woman in her mid to late 20s called Levana, who grew up in a Jewish community in Paris in the recent past, and her grandmother, Hannah Lazare, the Madame Lazare of the title, who has an exciting and interesting but mysterious background. Levana has always heard the story of how during the Second World War that young teenage Hannah escaped from her native country of Estonia in the time of the Nazi invasion, that she made her way to London, that she met a young Jewish soldier who had arrived in London to join the force that was being put together by General de Gaulle. They fell in love, and after the war they moved to Paris, they got married, and she has lived the rest of her life in Paris. And Levana and Hannah have a close but difficult relationship because Levana was raised by her grandparents when her mother died when she was 6 years old. So they know each other very well. And as Hannah is kind of approaching the end of her life, she becomes increasingly confused in her mind, and kind of snippets and the Irish word bloody, kind of fragments of memory begin to emerge, often when Hannah is asleep. She talks in her sleep. And at this stage, Levana is living in Brussels, and she has brought Hannah to Brussels, and she's in a home. And Levana discovers, because she wants to find out what the old woman is saying, she feels this might be a little door into the past, because the grandmother has always been very, very kind of closed about her story and about her past. She just has these kind of bare bones of her story, what happened, and she will not entertain any questions. She doesn't want to talk about her family of origin, her childhood, anything. And she even denies that she even remembers a word of her native language. So when these words and these sentences kind of emerge, Levana is very excited, and she records her grandmother unknown to her, and she goes and finds an Estonian translator who's working with the European Commission in Brussels. They meet, and the translator tells her that the words that her grandmother is speaking is not Estonian. It is in fact utterances in the Irish language. So that's the I suppose the mystery. The story has a kind of a structure of a mystery, and on that kind of spine there's lots of other stuff kind of hung to do with I suppose memory, to do with identity and the relationship between memory and identity. And religion as well. That was a thing that kind of seemed to emerge more and more as I wrote the book.
So why did you write this huge novel? What prompted you?
Well, I wanted to, as you said, I hadn't written a novel, but I've written quite a lot of other things over the years. I've done quite a lot of script writing, so I have learned, I suppose, a lot about plot and about emotional journeys and, you know, character arcs and all those kind of things. And I really wanted to kind of use all that kind of theory and to kind of, you know, write a novel. Because when you're writing a script, it's quite strict about what you can and cannot put in the script. You know, you put the speech, obviously, you put kind of a general kind of description of where it's happening, but you are not allowed to go into a lot of detail. You're not allowed to say, for example, what tone of voice that the actor is using, the character is using. You're not allowed to say how they're moving. You're not allowed to imagine, you know,
the landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's all somebody else's job. That's the director's job, or it's the actor's job, or the art director's job. But when you're writing a novel, you know, you have it all, as it were, and I really wanted to do that. So this had come kind of on the back of another book I wrote. It was a biography of a poet from my native county Mayo in the west of Ireland, who was active in the early 19th century, called Raftery. He was a songwriter and a poet, and I'd always been interested in him. And the way I wrote that book, because a lot of books of that type, written in Irish especially, are kind of often they're adaptations of like a, you know, some sort of a thesis, or they have begun in academia, whereas the origin of my book was actually a film script. I was commissioned to write a docudrama about Raftery's life, and I had the skeleton of his story.
So the book came second.
The book came second, yeah, because I kind of fleshed it out. So then when I had that done, I enjoyed it enormously you're working with something of that scale, and I kind of missed it. And I had this other idea, and that came from something that my father told me about a man in our part of County Mayo who had probably died around the 20s, 30s. And it's important, I suppose, to mention as well that I grew up speaking English in County Mayo, but it's an English which is very much kind of has a very Irish flavour to it in that. And the reason for that is that the community I grew up in had gone through an enormous cultural and linguistic change in like the late 19th, early 20th century. So this man had kind of gone, his life had been, you know, in that experience. He had obviously been born when Irish was like the dominant language, and then he had married. There was a lot of shame about the Irish language at the time. It was because after the famine of the 1840s, that was a huge kind of, I think, sort of a psychic crisis, really. And it was what kind of broke the spirit of the Irish language kind of community, which was quite big at the beginning at that time. Emigration, 1 million people died in the famine. I mean, an awful lot of them would have been native Irish speakers. Another million emigrated quite quickly after those years. Many of them would have been native Irish speakers. And then that continued. So there was a huge big shock, and then there was a hemorrhaging after that. And this man, anyway, to get back to the seed of the idea of the story that my dad gave me, he had always spoken English to his wife and his children, his grandchildren. He was not known to have any knowledge of Irish. But in his final years, he succumbed to some form of dementia, and he lost the ability to speak English. And the only speech he had left was Irish. And people were, you know, really amazed that was all he had left. And I loved that story, and I was intrigued by it. And I suppose I was very curious about what was he saying, because nobody around him would know. But I was saying, if I was there, I'd know what he was saying. So I just felt I had to do something with this kind of this scenario, and so it really grew from that. To be honest, that little seed kind of just gave me space to kind of come up with the whole thing, bit by bit.
That was going to be my question. Bit by bit, or did you have an overall schema before you wrote? I mean, it's a very elaborate plot. Did you make it up as you went along, or how did you get all the bits to join up? Because it's like a jigsaw.
Yeah, I think I did. I pursued certain ideas, and then certain discoveries as I went along kind of suggested other ideas. For example, I'll give you an example. For example, the Jewish community is important in this story. This Jewish community in Paris, and how they practice their religion is important. But when I decided that the character was a woman, and I decided that she had been born on the Aran Islands into a household where memory was hugely important. Her father was an illiterate or pre-literate storyteller, so he couldn't write. Certainly, he couldn't write Irish, but so his whole kind of way of recording everything he knew in terms of his whole repertoire of story was in his memory, and that was kind of that was the normal thing, and so memory was hugely important in terms of the cultural life of the people. And the little girl who became Madame Lazare, this little islander, had huge respect for her father and was very proud of him, and had, as we see going through the book, as she gets a bit older as a teenager, she has an ambition to be a storyteller, to be a kind of the sort of vessel of the memory of her people. So I started kind of thinking about, well, what did she remember, or what stuff did she know? And so I then began to draw on some of the work I've done myself as a musician and also as a publisher, because some years ago I started working with children in Connemara, where I live, which is an Irish-speaking part of Ireland, and we started putting together collections of traditional rhymes, which were kind of falling out of use in the community, and which were became kind of falling into disuse basically. And so I set the children the task of going out into the community and talking to their grandparents, their neighbours, and collecting rhymes and bringing them back. And we made
just
a
like the commission.
Exactly.
In the 1930s.
Exactly. So I had filled that role myself as much later on. And so I gave all those rhymes that I had learnt myself from that process. I said, she knows those rhymes, she knows all that stuff. And then I began to think as well about, her sense of, she was a child who lost her mother in childbirth. So she had survived, and her twin brother had survived, and her twin brother had, there had been a problem with the birth, obviously, and he had a severe learning disability, and she was kind of, sort of almost like a guardian angel to look after him.
Taking care of him, yeah.
And people would say things like, the way adults say things to children, certainly did that time, that your mother was too good for this world and she was taken up, to heaven to help the Blessed Virgin, and your job now is to look after your brother. And I just began to kind of think about that, and also think about, she's like 8 years old, how she kind of envisages how religion works, and it's very, very connected to folklore. So she has a lot of stories which are to do with, how there's one story which is really important to the plot, is how the limpet, which is a little shellfish, yeah, how it has the ability to stick itself to a rock. And that's a story which involves Ansláinithir, which he always calls him, the saviour. And the stories begin, Nervi Ansláinithir Shúlar Atala, when the saviour was walking the earth. This happened and that happened. But also, I found a collection of these stories in a fantastic book that's been written, and it was also, I think, a PhD thesis by a man called Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin, who was a lecturer in folklore in Galway University. And he had collected and had kind of put together this survey, as it were, of stories from the Irish folklore tradition, which featured characters from the Bible. And so little Mairead, who became Madame Lazare, was really very familiar with all this. And this was in fact her religion. These folk tales, which have no basis at all in
Orthodox
Christianity. Those were her religion, and those were the stories that really she felt were much more interesting than the stories that the teacher had in school about, the one day when the Saviour was feeding the crowds with fish and bread and all that. She thought her dad's story is much more interesting. So
they were
better told and more exciting. But the thing that was interesting to me, and all kind of slightly shocking to me as well about those stories, which there was an area of them that I wasn't familiar with in the tradition, and they're actually quite anti-Semitic, because they often feature this kind of crowd of Jews who are chasing our Lord and Saviour and are trying to kill him. And the stories are set, I can see them in my mind in like beaches I walk in Connemara on a regular basis. And I can imagine the Saviour, hiding behind the rock, and Murad could imagine it as well. So that was really kind of stopped me in my tracks. And then I knew that something terrible had happened, which kind of drove her away, which made her to suppress all this memory all her life and to live a secret life, and that she was going to struggle with this. This was going to be the big struggle of her life. But I decided that it would be interesting and kind of tragic and conflictual if she ended up in a Jewish community in Paris. So that's kind of where that idea came from.
That's a bit of a risk, though, isn't it? We all hear about cultural appropriation these days, and whether a writer should or can take on another culture or another environment and portray it. And in this case, something as sensitive as the Jewish religion. Did you feel nervous about that? Or?
I did, but I thought I was on a fairly solid ground, because Madame Lazare was very conflicted herself about doing just that thing because what she had done. There are a lot of spoiler alerts. I should maybe put up my hand out here. But what she had done really all her life was pretend that she was Jewish. She pretended that she was an Estonian Jew and so forth. And she felt very conflicted about that. She felt guilty about it. She felt she really regretted that was at some point, when she arrived in Paris, that decision was made, that was going to be her cover story, as it were.
And there was no going back.
And there was no going back. And then when her daughter, the mother of Lavanna, died, the daughter had become very very devout, and her dying wish was that her daughter, Lavanna, Hannah's granddaughter, would be raised in this kind of very devout form of Judaism that Hannah was not even very familiar with, because they had lived quite secular Jews up until then. So it adds kind of pressure to Hannah, but it also, I found as I wrote it, and this wasn't something I sat down and this was something that really evolved in the writing. But I found that I suppose somebody from another country who would read the part about young Murad on the Aran Islands and her Catholicism, which is very folkloric in a certain way, might find that quite exotic. Whereas to me, I think a lot of Irish people, it's quite familiar. It's close enough to the kind of form of Catholicism I grew up with myself, that kind of sense of I'm thinking of my mother's relationship with the Blessed Virgin, for example, who was a really important kind of deity in her life. It was like a goddess that was really
Bandia
Gadira Khan, who was hugely supportive to my mother in her spiritual life. My mother saw her as a mother, as somebody who had gone through the things that she was going through, who she could talk to, and so that was the kind of the flavour of the religious kind of life.
But you also depicted sort of quite a cruel church, and the priest being quite vicious to little girl. And
no, it was the teacher actually. It was the teacher rather than the priest, because I felt that there had been quite a lot of vicious priests in fiction, and I wanted to see if I could.
Have a vicious teacher instead.
Yeah, give viciousness to the teacher, and I ended up writing about two priests who were actually quite reasonable and kind,
understanding,
and kind men.
Yeah.
So.
And maybe I misunderstood, but I had a feeling at times that, and it may have been in the little girl's imagination, that she was afraid of what authority, as represented by the priest and the school, would do to her little severely disabled brother.
Well, there was that comes up in the towards the end of the book. So Mairead basically is left to look after. She's a teenager at this stage, and she's left to look after her severely handicapped brother. And she has always seen as kind of as her mission. You know, she's always been told that this is the job that the Blessed Virgin basically gave her to do. Yeah. And she doesn't want to give it up. She just has amazing loyalty to her brother, even though it's a really difficult path for her to take. And the priest, out of kindness and wanting to,
protect her.
Yeah, and kind of save her from herself. He comes and he says, we have to put a deadline on this. If something isn't done, if this isn't resolved, I'm just going to have to intervene and take your brother into an institution in Galway, and that will be a much better outcome for him, and it'll be a better outcome for you, because you can join your sister in America. And
so it's mixed, I suppose. It's about good and bad.
Yeah.
Your references to folklore on the island are very rich and very poetic, but there's also a cruelty to life on the island. Did you find stylistically it hard to sort of negotiate those two and to depict them both evenly?
Well, I suppose what I was trying to do was I was trying to depict as well as I could how this cultural life, which was like, what you'd call folklore, how it worked, how it functioned for the people who were involved in it. And I suppose I was drawing, then on my experience. I lived here in Dublin. When I came to college in Dublin, I grew up in rural County Mayo. I came to college here in Dublin. I lived in Dublin for 20 years, got married, went to the west of Ireland. I was initially working in TV, and I've lived there since for about 20 years. And during those years, I have kind of discovered, as it were, I found a tribe of people that I meet up with on a regular basis, of traditional singers and musicians. But it's not at all purist. There are kind of quite a few songwriters in the group, and it's just a session. We meet every week, and I wouldn't get to go there every week. It's on tonight, so I'm going to miss it. But there are a lot of traditional singers, of sean-nós singers, which is a form of traditional song in the Irish language. And I suppose, having been around those people for years now, and just kind of talking to them about the songs and why they choose them, I found that there are families where, like, the traditional singing thing is really, it's been passed down in the DNA, as it were. So you have a family. There's a woman I have worked with on various recordings I've done for children, but she's a wonderful traditional singer. Her father was a wonderful singer, and her son is a fantastic singer. And just talking to her and talking to the son, who's now like in his early 20s, you can see that the songs, they're not thinking of, this is the canon of Irish traditional verse and we must preserve it. It's not like that at all. It's about, this is the song that Dad would sing, or this is the song. Yes. Yeah. So it's a very personal kind of connection that goes back the generations, and they see themselves as part of that kind of fabric. Not in a very kind of down-to-earth way, these are the local songs, and they just love them. And so that was kind of, I suppose it's a rare enough thing now in the early 21st century that you have that kind of gathering, but it's such a natural part of the week. And so it wasn't really very difficult for me to, jump back to the 1940s and 1930s, and
because of that tradition, because you've been exposed to it.
Exactly. Like we were in one pub for years before COVID, which was like it's like a thatched cottage. I mean, it's all kind of cliched in a way, but we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And, there might be, sometimes in the winter, there might be only 4 or 5 people there. There was a big turf fire on. And you just sit there, we just sit there singing to each other, and talking and laughing and joking or whatever. And so I had, in a certain way, I had that experience, which would not be very different, to create this kind of scene of them, these people in the 1930s and 1940s gathering around the fireplace. I suppose the repertoire would be different. There would be more stories, which is really, you don't really hear stories told in that kind of setting now.
Is that because of time, do you think? They take too long?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that. And also I think that the traditional Irish music session is a kind of it's an institution in itself.
With its own rules, yeah.
Exactly, and I don't think that storytelling really fits into that.
And did you want to integrate that into the novel, or did it just seem organic that it would be there, that it would have a place in the novel?
Well, I think because I had this idea of filling this Madame Lazare, when she was a child, filling her head with these kind of artifacts of memory and of folklore, that it was only natural that her father was a storyteller, and that they would come together in the house, and that she would have really a longing to be part of that circle, and that she would be listening when she was a child and really keenly interested in it.
And it gave you then the whole context for her early Irish life before she became a false person with a false identity in Paris.
Yes, indeed, yes.
I wanted to ask you about language in the novel, because it's quite interesting to have an Irish language novel where people are speaking to each other in French, where there are freedoms to speak lots of different languages, and how that challenged you as a writer. I mean, did you hold yourself back and say, well, I can intimate this, or I'll spell this little bit out, or this bit will be in English? Because there are different languages within the book, a few words of Hebrew.
Correct, yeah. I suppose, I mean, I could have written a story which was just set in the Aran Islands, which didn't have all this other European stuff in it. But I just didn't think I could sustain that for the length of a novel. And also, I wanted to do something a bit more unusual, I suppose. And I suppose I'm interested in the Irish language in a broader context, and it does have a broader context. And like we'll be talking a little while about translation, and it's amazing the amount of people I have found in a few short weeks and months
we'll come to that in a minute.
who can actually work directly from Irish to other languages. So there is, it does have it is a small minoritized language here in Ireland. There's no doubt about it, but it has an unusual kind of a background which gives it a lot of reach, through the Irish diaspora and so forth. So I wanted to come at it from different angles, and I wanted chunks of it to be in the contemporary world, and also I wanted to set some of it certainly outside the English-speaking world, because there is, I find that fiction written in Irish at the moment, contemporary fiction, if it's a contemporary story, it's quite a lot of the stories that are being written they're set in Ireland, they're written in Irish, but it's really you really understand that the action is actually happening in English. And there's quite a bit of that. And I mean, I understand completely the validity of that, but personally I have sort of signed a contract with myself that if I'm going to write, fiction in Irish, there has to be kind of a reason that it's in Irish, that I think there are stories, I think there are unploughed fields and untapped kind of possibilities there that I want to get at. And I want my characters, the Irish characters, to be from an Irish-speaking world. and I want them to tell those stories. Okay, the French part is, it was more difficult to write that because of voice. And actually, that's just to wind back for a second. Like the practicalities of writing in Irish, if you work with characters who are native speakers, it's so much easier to work with voice because you can hear them. You know exactly what they sound like. The characters in the Aran Islands. It's not that I tried obsessively, to use words that had been used by Aran Islanders in the 30s. I didn't feel I needed to go that far. But if you speak Irish and if you read Irish, you will feel that it's a West of Ireland kind of texture in the language. Whereas the other parts, which we understand that they're happening in French, that was a much more neutral kind of a register. I came across a recording of Salman Rushdie talking about some of the novels he wrote that were set in India, and there would be characters who would be speaking Indian languages, even though he's written it in English. And he used the word idiolect, that he had to write something which, even though he was writing it in English, for the story it wasn't English. And he said that was some of the most difficult prose he has written. And I found that kind of tricky as well. So say when Hannah Lazare is in Paris, I would have used words, in Irish, even though we kind of know what's happening in French, that she would never have used as a native Irish speaker. Not big things, but just things that would
show the foreignness of it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a subtle thing, but it was important for me to feel that I was getting it right, or try to get it right anyway. Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings us nicely on to the whole issue of translation. And one of the fascinating things about Madame Lazare is that it hasn't just been feted in Ireland. It did win the Best Irish Language Book in the Irish Book Awards, sponsored by Post. But it was also nominated by Literature Ireland for the European Prize for Literature, the first time ever that an Irish language novel was nominated for this award. And it received a special mention, one of only four, I think, is it four?
Four, I think, yeah.
4 novels from 14 to receive this special mention. And that has opened a whole box of opportunities.
It certainly has.
Tell us what's happened since you received the nomination.
Well, some very surprising things have happened. Number one, the office of the European Union Prize for Literature in Brussels are very, very supportive and have and are organising events.
You'll be in Frankfurt at the Frankfurt Book Fair next month?
Correct. They have just organised kind of slots for me on podcasts in the States. I did an interview in France this week, and also they wanted to organise for all the special mentions. They wanted to organise events in the bookshop in the country of your origin. And so I'm doing a public interview with Tadhg Mac is going to talk to me in Kenny's in Galway in November. So I'm really excited. So lots have happened. But on the translation front, it's interesting because one of the characters in the book is a translator who works with the European Commission, and lo and behold, there is a translator from Estonia who works in the European Commission who has fantastic Irish. And he independently...
somehow discovered the book.
He discovered the book. Before he contacted me, he contacted a publisher in Estonia. Yeah. So he's working on that translation at the moment.
And the contract's been signed and the book will appear in Estonian.
Yes, indeed.
And that's the first contract.
That's the first one, and I've been invited to a festival in Tallinn next May. And the second one is their contract has been signed for a translation to Serbian. And that is being done directly from Irish, again, which is pretty surprising, by a woman who is based in Berlin and who has a bilingual background. She, I think one of her parents was Serbian and the other was German, and she is also she's working on trying to find a publisher to publishers in German, and she would do that. She'd do the translation as well.
And she's some Irish.
Oh yeah, she
Yeah.
would work directly
So
from Irish. Yeah, she would work directly from Irish.
This
Yeah.
has generated a response that is quite extraordinary, because people are coming out of the woodwork who have Irish and who are interested in the book and want to translate it into their languages, which is both wonderful for you as the author, but also wonderful for Literature Ireland, that wants to promote works from the English and the Irish language and have them translated as widely as possible across the globe. So suddenly we have an Estonian with absolutely fluent Irish who wants to do more books once he's finished your book, and so it's a service to the whole community.
Exactly.
It's really exciting.
Yeah.
So that's Estonian, Serbian, possibly German,
Yeah.
and
Well, I mean, one of the ways that the European Prize
supports
the
nominated writers.
the special mentions is that there is a pot of money to help promote translation. So what we're doing is we are commissioning sample translations in a number of languages. So we have Elvira, I spoke to you about, is going to do the German one. We have found a translator in Spain who's working directly from Irish. And Alex Hymans is going to do it in Dutch.
Right.
He is a very interesting character. He's based in Brazil, and he writes original fiction in Irish and in Dutch. And so he's fantastically well placed. He translated Cíle na Cile to Dutch. So he's.
And I think the Spanish writer the Spanish translator is a writer as well.
Correct.
Do you think having a writer who's a translator will change the translation in any way?
It's hard to know, but it'll certainly be interesting to.
I suppose it's early days yet.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be able to assess a translation in Spanish, but it'll be interesting to have those conversations and just, figure out. I would love to work closely with the translators. Just because I'm so curious about,
And how do you feel about using English as a bridging language? I mean, are you opposed to it?
Not at all, no. I have actually done a working translation in English myself.
So the working translation you did, which was to help Literature Ireland when it went to promote the book, was done sort of with a tight enough deadline, but you did it, thank you. And then when it became apparent that this project really had legs and that you had received a special mention, you passed that working translation on to another translator. How did that feel?
Well, that's actually not quite.
Okay, I've got it wrong.
Quite happened. Yes, I think that translator had been commissioned originally.
Read part of it, had she?
Yes, she commissioned to translate a chunk of it, but she was actually really
On
busy
board.
this work.
Okay.
She was working on she was translating a French novel to Irish, so that was a big project for her. So I kind of worked with what she had done, and then when that much was done, and I saw it in English, and I suppose I could really envision it then, and I decided to keep going, and I did a bit of work on what she had done, and so I chipped away at it, and.
Is it comfortable, though, to have somebody else, when you're a native speaker of English, is it comfortable to have somebody else translating it into English? How precious are you about your words, I suppose is what I'm asking.
Well, I don't think I'm particularly precious about words, but I suppose what I want to find is the tone of the character. That's kind of really important.
You want to get it right, yeah.
Yeah, and I would be thinking more. I think more about character than language, to be honest. I think that the whole thing emerges from character, and from the voice of the character, and from the motivations of the character. And
Is this your script writing?
Oh, it is, I think so. Yeah, and maybe it's I think so. And so that's kind of that's what drives me. And I suppose it's where character and plot meet. I think that's really the sweet spot that I kind of love working with, and just developing and taking apart and rewriting and so forth. Yeah.
how many legs do you think this project has? Where do you think, how long,
no
how many
idea.
translations? I mean, it's been so exciting in the past just 8 months. We've got how many? Five translations up and running. It just shows the power of a prize.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah.
And a prize outside of Ireland. I think the fact that it's the European Union Prize for Literature has created an interest that might not have happened had it just stayed in Ireland as a book.
Yeah, and I have to say, and I'm very happy to say this publicly here, I mean, it was the nomination that by Literature Ireland which really got the ball rolling, and I'm really very grateful for that. Like, it was, I suppose, in a certain way, taking a chance with it. So it was great that it was, it worked out and the special mention happened.
It's such a lovely novel. I mean, and for a European audience, it makes so much sense to promote a book like this, which, marks so much, or makes reference to so many things that happened in the 20th century. Things like the Shoah, things like the Blitz, things like the Europeanization of the margins, in a sense, so that you have Estonian translators or you have Irish translators working in Brussels, the European Union. It is such a rich novel to present to Europe. It was a very easy choice, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, just because we've been here in Europe, we've been living with this war since 24th of February, and it just, in a certain way, just there are certain scenes in the book where there are rockets falling from the sky at one point in the Blitz, and that's a kind of a memory which is like seared in the brain of Madame Lazare. And
that trauma.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's just so strange that's all happening again, and so just terribly tragic and cruel and just awful. I mean, yeah, it's kind of strange to watch all that, having been, having sort of constructed a story about that,
yeah.
and kind of thinking of it as, almost stuff out of a film, that you see it there, and it's just the lives that have been destroyed in Ukraine this year, and in Russia,
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, would the audience like to ask some questions? Thank you very much, Tadhg. There's a question straight away.
You said something earlier when you were talking about reading other books in the Irish language that they're written in Irish, they speak in Irish, but the events themselves are almost happening in English.
Yes.
And as a non-Irish speaker, I thought that was really fascinating. Could you expand more on what you meant by that?
Well, I suppose, say there are some great stories, I suppose, to be told about Northern Ireland, for example. So that you have writers who grew up in Belfast, and they're writing those stories, and they have chosen to write them in Irish. But you still get the sense that what you are reading is kind of a bit broader than the Irish language. You'll have soldiers speaking Irish, for example, British soldiers speaking Irish, for example, that kind of thing. And that's one example. But then there are other kind of stories, set in kind of, middle-class Dublin, and for no reason particularly of realism, they're speaking Irish. And, I mean, the argument is that, well, okay, Romeo and Juliet is set in Italy and they're speaking English, and, lots of stuff is written, in that way. And that is absolutely true, and I accept that. But I suppose I have made the choice myself as a writer that I want to kind of draw from this well of, where Irish is the first language, and the people who are, at least some of the characters, belong to that unbroken tradition of 2,000 years. That for me is, and as I said to Sinead, it makes it just easier, on a practical level, because it's much easier to write voice. I did find when I was, there are sections in the novel which are based in Paris and in Brussels, in the French-speaking world. And even though we know that the people are speaking French, it's written in Irish. And I did find that difficult to deal with practically in terms of voice. It was challenging, and it was in loads of ways much easier to write the stuff that's set in Aran.
Do you think
in
if there
terms
were
of voice.
more novels written in Irish in the contemporary world, would that be easier?
It would be easier for
easier for you
to
because
get
it was
over
just,
this.
Yeah, well, because it would be more normalised to have books written in the Irish language where characters are speaking different languages.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I think there's great potential for it. I mean, you know, we see what's going on now with film. You know, these stories that are being told, and it is very much actually it's very much part of the policy of Tadhg Mac that the stories must be credible in the Irish language, and I think that really works. I think that really works, and I suppose I'm drawing as well again from my script writing kind of background in that that kind of realism, because there have been TV series made, you know, set in cities and you know, with all sorts of details in them which are difficult to believe in Irish, and I can see that that's a valid thing to do, but personally I would find it hard to write. That's just me. That's just me.
Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? Well, Annette?
I suppose generally from a translation point of view, as a translator, I'm not a literary translator, if you weren't happy with the direction the translation was going in, do you think you'd interfere then, and you know, how would you deal with that?
Well, I think the only language I would really have the level to feel confident to express an opinion would be a translation into English, because I mean I do speak French, but I wouldn't have that level of sophistication in French that I could. I would be very interested to see what, you know, how they would deal with the different kind of flavors and textures of language that's needed in the Paris part and the West of Ireland part. But I don't think I would probably get into a big row about it.
Anybody else? Well, I think
about Estonia, what inspired you to use Estonia? You know, there were a lot of Eastern European displaced persons, and a lot of them, I suppose, disguised or forgot a lot of their backstories. There's a lot of stories that haven't been told, but why Estonia rather than Poland or?
Well, it was a very practical thing in that I needed to find. This was when I was kind of just working on the plot. I mean, I had thought of Poland, but then I thought that, you know, if Hannah Lazare was pretending to be Polish, it would be much easier. There would be much more chance that she would meet other Polish people in Paris.
so a small population.
Yeah, so that like a more obscure kind of language. I mean, you know, a bigger population than the Irish language, so it was just a sort of question of plot and just Estonia. Why did I pick Estonia instead of Lithuania or Latvia or one of those others? I just happened years ago when I was working in RTE and television. I was working on a festival in the west of Ireland. We happened to meet a bunch of Estonian musicians. I really thought they were great, and so it's just a really whimsical decision, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, I think that might bring us to a natural close. Thank you so much, Tadhg.
Thank you.
Gur míle magat. Thank you, everybody, for coming along this evening. Perhaps we'd join our hands and congratulate Tadhg once again.